Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi built something that the paranormal investigation genre had never previously attempted at scale. Not a team of investigators with equipment and methodology chasing evidence through haunted locations. A partnership between a physical medium whose claimed ability to perceive the dead was genuine enough in its consistency and specificity to resist easy dismissal, and a retired NYPD homicide detective whose professional skepticism and investigative discipline provided the evidentiary framework the show needed to be taken seriously. Together they created The Dead Files, 14 seasons of television whose emotional weight and psychological intensity exceeded anything the Travel Channel had previously produced in the paranormal space. And then, in the years after the show reached the end of its run, what happened to both of them became a story that the format they had built was never designed to tell. It is more complicated than what most people know, more personal than what has been reported, and more heartbreaking than anything The Dead Files ever documented on camera. Stay until the end. The complete story starts right now. The Dead Files premiered on the Travel Channel on September 16, 2011. The format was unlike anything in the paranormal investigation genre that preceded it. Amy Allan would visit a location with no prior knowledge of its history, conducting a walk that she described as a process of perceiving the residual presence of people who had died there. Steve DiSchiavi would conduct a parallel investigation using the tools and methodology of his 2 decades as a New York City Police Department homicide detective. Record searches, witness interviews, historical documentation, the standard evidentiary approach of a professional investigator. The two would not compare notes or discuss their findings during production. Only in the final reveal conducted in front of the clients who had requested the investigation would their parallel accounts be placed alongside each other for the first time. What the format produced, when it worked, was something that the genre had never quite achieved. The specificity of Amy Allan's perceptions consistently aligned with historical documentation that Steve DiSchiavi uncovered through entirely conventional investigative means. Not in the vague, impressionistic way that cold reading produces alignment, but with the specific detail: names, dates, causes of death, physical descriptions of structures that no longer existed, events whose records required genuine archival investigation to locate, that made the show genuinely difficult to dismiss for viewers who engaged with it seriously. The Dead Files built an audience whose relationship to it was not the casual parasocial connection that most television generates. These were viewers who studied the cases, who verified the historical research independently, who engaged with what they were watching as something closer to investigation than entertainment. That audience was built by 2 people whose professional and personal investment in what the show was doing went significantly deeper than the production format required. If you want more content like this, subscribe right now before we go any further. The story of what happened to this cast is one you need to hear. Amy Allan was born in Denver, Colorado. She has described her earliest experiences of perceiving the dead as beginning in childhood, in the specific way that people who carry this kind of claimed ability across their entire lives describe it, not as something that arrived fully formed, but as something that was present before she had a framework for understanding it, that shaped her childhood in ways that the people around her were not always equipped to support or even acknowledge. The specific character of what she perceives, the emotional residue of deaths, the physical presentation of the dead as she experiences them, the specific information that comes through those perceptions, is something she has described consistently across 14 seasons of The Dead Files and across the interviews and public communications that accompanied the show's run. What she has been more careful about discussing publicly is what that ability costs her. The Dead Files documented, in each episode, the process of a walk through a location and the reveal of what Amy had perceived. What the cameras did not document was what came before and after, the preparation required to deliberately open a perceptive capacity that most people who carry it spend their lives trying to manage and contain. The aftermath of sustained contact with the emotional residue of violent deaths, of the specific quality of presence that locations associated with extreme suffering carry, and that the show deliberately sought out because those were the locations whose clients needed the most help, and the cumulative weight of 14 seasons of that sustained exposure on a person for whom the experience was not performative, but genuinely felt. The people who worked alongside Amy Allan across the run of the show have described someone whose commitment to the cases was absolute, and whose management of the personal cost of that commitment was something they watched with concern that grew across the seasons rather than diminishing with familiarity. She was not performing sensitivity. She was genuinely affected by what she encountered in those locations. encounters, and the specific character of what those encounters produced in her. The dreams that followed intense walks, the difficulty of leaving certain locations behind psychologically when the production physically moved on, is the dimension of her 14 seasons on the Dead Files that the episode format documented around without ever being able to document directly. Her personal life across the production years carried its own weight. She married Matt Anderson, the show's producer and one of its executive producers, a relationship that developed within the specific crucible of a production whose demands were unlike those of conventional television. The combination of professional and personal life within a single demanding production created a context that the people who have observed similar arrangements in other high-pressure creative environments recognize as capable of extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary difficulty in approximately equal measure. What that combination produced across the years of the Dead Files run, and in the years since, is a story that Amy Allan's public communications address only partially, and that the people around her have been careful about discussing in specific terms. Steve DiSchiavi spent 21 years as a detective in the New York City Police Department before the Dead Files brought him into paranormal television. His career in homicide investigation gave him a professional history whose specific character shaped everything about how he approached the show's investigative side. 21 years of building cases from evidence, of interviewing witnesses whose accounts contained contradictions and omissions and the specific distortions that trauma introduces into memory, of sitting with families whose experience of loss was recent and raw, and who needed someone to take their situation seriously enough to actually investigate it rather than simply acknowledge it. That professional background was not incidental to what the Dead Files was. It was the evidentiary spine of the entire format. What 21 years of homicide investigation also produces in a person is something that the professional framework of law enforcement rarely provides adequate space to address: the cumulative exposure to violent death, the sustained proximity to the worst things that human beings do to each other, and to the specific suffering that those things produce in the people left behind. The NYPD detective who spent 2 decades building his career in that environment and then transitioned into paranormal television was not leaving that exposure behind. He was adding to it. The Dead Files specifically sought out locations associated with violent death, murders, suicides, accidents whose character was extreme enough that the residual presence associated with them was still perceptible decades or centuries later. Steve DiSchiavi spent 14 seasons investigating the histories of those locations, sitting with the documentation of those deaths, interviewing the descendants and survivors and witnesses whose lives the events had shaped. He was not investigating the paranormal in spite of his homicide background. He was investigating it through it, and the specific weight of that combination, 21 years of the NYPD followed by 14 seasons of the Dead Files, is something that the professional stoicism that his background cultivated made genuinely difficult to discuss openly. He has spoken in interviews about the specific challenge of what the Dead Files asked of him. The locations were not the comfortable distance of a cold case file. He was in the rooms where the things happened, talking to the people still affected by them, building the evidentiary picture of events whose human cost was still being paid by the families who had called the show for help. The detective's discipline that made him effective at that work also made it structurally difficult to acknowledge what the work was producing in him personally, and across 14 seasons of that discipline applied to that specific kind of material, the accumulation became something that the professional framework could not contain indefinitely. The Dead Files asked something specific of both of its central figures that no comparable paranormal investigation show had previously asked of a cast in quite the same way. It asked them to be genuinely present with people in crisis, not to investigate interesting paranormal claims in potentially haunted buildings, to sit with families whose daily lives had been disrupted by whatever they were experiencing in their homes, whose children were frightened, whose relationships were strained, whose capacity to function normally in the spaces they lived in had been compromised by things they could not explain and had found no effective help for, and to take those situations seriously enough to bring every available resource to understanding what was happening and what might help. That specific quality of genuine presence with other people's suffering is what built the Dead Files' audience, and what made the show feel different from anything else in the genre. It is also what made the sustained production of it across 14 seasons uniquely demanding on the people at its center. Amy Allan brought perceptive capacities that made her directly and genuinely affected by the environments she investigated. Steve DiSchiavi brought a professional history that made the human dimension of every case personally resonant in ways that his detective's discipline could manage but not eliminate. Together, they created a show whose emotional authenticity was the product of two people genuinely investing themselves in work, whose cost they were absorbing across 14 seasons without an adequate mechanism for processing what that absorption produced. The production schedule of The Dead Files was not the schedule of a show whose cast could maintain protective distance from the material. Cases required travel to locations across the country. Each investigation demanded genuine engagement with the history of what had happened in a location and with the people currently living with the consequences of that history. There was no comfortable separation between the professional work and the personal impact of that work. The show was built on the absence of that separation, and 14 seasons of its absence left marks on both of its central figures that the episode credits were never designed to acknowledge. Every episode of The Dead Files concluded with what the show called the reveal, the moment when Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi, having conducted their parallel investigations without communication, would sit with the clients and present their findings for the first time together. The emotional weight of those moments was not manufactured for television. The clients were real people who had come to the end of the conventional explanations available to them and had accepted an unconventional offer of help from a show that was, whatever else it was, genuinely trying to help them. The reveal was the moment when the help either arrived or did not, when Amy's perceptions either aligned with the historical documentation in ways that explained what the clients had been experiencing or failed to produce the coherence that made the investigation meaningful. What the format could not protect against was the emotional cost of the reveals that landed hardest. The cases where the history Amy perceived matched what Steve documented in ways that meant the clients were living with something genuinely extreme, where the recommendation for what the family should do about their situation was not a comfortable one, where the investigation had confirmed something that the clients had hoped would turn out to be explainable in ordinary terms. Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi sat through hundreds of those moments across 14 seasons. They sat with families receiving news that their homes contained things that had no conventional resolution. They delivered that news honestly, because the format demanded honesty, and because both of them were people whose professional backgrounds made dishonesty as a form of comfort genuinely unavailable to them. And they absorbed the emotional impact of those moments, season after season, with the specific stoicism that their respective professional histories had cultivated and that the format of the show made necessary. The Dead Files concluded its original run after 14 seasons. What followed for Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi individually is a story whose public dimensions are partial and whose private dimensions the people who know them have been careful about addressing in specific terms. What is visible in the public record is two people who gave 14 seasons of genuine investment to work that cost them more than the format ever acknowledged, and who have been navigating the post-show years in ways that reflect the specific character of what that investment produced. Amy Allan has continued to work in paranormal investigation in formats that reflect a person managing a capacity whose demands are real and cumulative rather than a performer moving between projects. Her public presence since the show's conclusion carries the specific quality of someone who has had to reckon with what 14 seasons of deliberate engagement with the most extreme locations the Travel Channel could identify produced in a person for whom that engagement was not performed. The recalibration that follows that kind of sustained exposure is not a quick process and is not a linear one, and the audience that watched her walk through those locations for 14 seasons and felt the genuine weight of what she was encountering deserves to understand that the weight was real and that the after was not a simple return to ordinary life. Steve DiSchiavi has navigated the post-show years with the specific stoicism that his professional background cultivated across more than 3 decades of work that did not leave room for public processing of personal costs. What that stoicism has cost him across the years since The Dead Files concluded is not something the public record addresses directly. What it does address is a person who invested 21 years in NYPD homicide and 14 years in The Dead Files, and who carries the accumulated weight of both of those sustained investments into whatever comes next. The specific challenge of finding a framework for that weight after the professional structures that contained it are gone is something that every person who builds their life around demanding work eventually faces. Steve DiSchiavi is facing it now, and the version of that reckoning that a person with his specific history faces is not the ordinary version. The Dead Files changed something in the paranormal investigation genre that the shows that followed it have reflected without always acknowledging the source: the seriousness with which it treated the human dimension of paranormal experience. The evidentiary rigor that Steve DiSchiavi's investigative background brought to historical research that previous shows had conducted more loosely. The specific quality of Amy Allan's perceptions and the consistency with which they aligned with documented history in ways that made the show genuinely difficult to explain away. These contributions to the genre are real and they belong to Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi, and they exist entirely independently of what the years since the show's conclusion have produced for either of them. The families who called the Dead Files for help and who received it, whose investigations produced the specific alignment of Amy's perceptions and Steve's research that allowed them to understand what was happening in their homes and what they might do about it. Remember the show in terms that have nothing to do with anything that came after. They remember a woman who walked through their homes and described things she could not have known, and that turned out to be verifiable. They remember a detective who took their situation seriously enough to actually investigate it. That is the legacy that 14 seasons of the Dead Files produced. And it is the part of the story of what happened to its cast that the heartbreaking years cannot erase, and that both of them deserve to have acknowledged alongside everything else. Subscribe now for more stories like this one. There is a specific quality to the audience that the Dead Files built across 14 seasons that distinguishes it from the audiences that most paranormal television produces. These were not casual viewers who watched the show because it occupied a comfortable slot in their weekly schedule. They were people who engaged with the cases seriously, who verified the historical research independently, who followed the parallel investigation format with the specific attention of viewers who understood what the show was attempting and who cared whether it succeeded. That audience stayed with the Dead Files through seasons whose cases were genuinely difficult, through investigations whose outcomes were not always reassuring, through the specific discomfort of a show that did not offer the comfortable resolution that most paranormal television builds toward. They stayed because Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi gave them something to stay for. A consistent quality of genuine investment in work that the format made genuinely demanding. A refusal to produce comfortable answers when the evidence did not support them. And a specific quality of care for the families whose situations they investigated that the audience recognized as authentic because it was visible in every frame of every episode in ways that performance could not have sustained across 14 seasons. That audience is the reason the story of what happened to the cast of The Dead Files matters beyond the specific details of two people's post-show years. The people who watched 14 seasons of Amy Allan walking through locations and Steve DiSchiavi sitting with the families of the dead built a relationship with both of them that was more invested and more personal than the ordinary parasocial connection that television generates. When what happened to them after the show ended became visible to that audience, it landed differently than it would have landed for a less invested viewership. It landed the way news about someone you know lands, rather than the way news about someone you watched lands. That is the measure of what the Dead Files built, and it is the context within which the heartbreaking dimension of what came after deserves to be understood, not as the end of the story, as the part of the story that the show could never have anticipated, and that the audience that built itself around caring about what Amy Allan and Steve DiSchiavi were doing deserves to have told honestly. What happened to the cast of the Dead Files is heartbreaking in the specific way that things are heartbreaking when they involve people who gave more than the work required and absorbed more than the format acknowledged, and who have been navigating the after in ways that the 14 seasons of the show that made their names could not have prepared them for. Amy Allan spent 14 seasons deliberately opening herself to the emotional residue of the most extreme locations the production could identify, and bringing genuine perceptive capacity to work that the genre had never previously attempted in quite the same way. Steve DiSchiavi spent 14 seasons adding the specific weight of paranormal investigation's most demanding format to the accumulated weight of 21 years in NYPD homicide, and carrying the combination with the stoicism his professional history cultivated rather than the disclosure that would have made the carrying visible. Together, they produced something that the paranormal investigation genre needed, and that the Travel Channel gave them the platform to build across 14 seasons that changed what the genre understood itself to be capable of. The cost of building it was real. The after of having built it has been genuinely difficult in ways that the public record only partially captures, and the people who watched those 14 seasons and who built the specific quality of invested attention that the Dead Files audience produced deserve to know that the people at the center of it were genuinely present with what they were doing, and that the genuineness of that presence was the thing that made the show what it was, and the thing that made what followed as hard as it has been. That is the complete story, and it is more human and more complicated and more heartbreaking than anything the Dead Files ever documented on camera.